Today we speak to Jacob L. Shapiro, founder and chief strategist of Perch Perspectives, a political risk and consultancy firm. Perch Perspectives was founded by Mr. Shapiro, a former Stratfor and Geopolitical Futures analyst, on the idea that history, culture, and human experiences are as important to business and political strategies as power dynamics, economics, and geography. An analysis of history is an analysis of power, he says. Economics is a representation of culture. Human experience is defined by geography. Mr. Shapiro founded the company knowing that these forces are inseparable, and he strives to understand the roles that they play in identifying and solving important business and political challenges for his clients. We speak about geopolitics, the top 4 geopolitical issues in our post-COVID world. We speak about political risk and risk analysis industry. We get into a lot of things. It was a fantastic episode, a huge pleasure to speak with Jacob Shapiro, and I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much.
Jacob Shapiro, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. I really appreciate your time. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on today is because I saw a recent post of yours where you were going over some of your I believe it was titled the most important geopolitical issues post COVID-19. This podcast is about geopolitics, so I wanted to discuss what some of those are and share them with my listeners. But before we get into that, I'd like for you, if you can, to introduce yourself and maybe give some background on your business, your organization, what kind of services you supply, and why you are an expert in geopolitics, and you have this very interesting list.
Well, let's try and make it brief because nobody wants to hear me talk about myself. So I'm founder and chief strategist of Perch Perspectives, formerly worked at Stratfor for a number of years, and then at Geopolitical Futures for a number of years after that. I cut my teeth as a Middle East analyst. That was really where I started, sort of into the Arab Spring, did a degree in Middle Eastern studies. My languages are Arabic and Hebrew and all that good stuff. And just kind of slowly worked my way up this political risk world. Perch is really trying to do something different in the marketplace. We're a very small company, so we're like a boutique consultancy in that sense. So we're very aligned with a smaller number of clients rather than trying to be all things to all people. But we also describe ourselves as a human-centric firm. And I think part of what's happened in the political risk space is that things have veered too far towards really overemphasis of structural forces, even edging on determinism, where people just say, oh, there's a river here, so now I will forecast these geopolitical things about a country.
Right.
And we really try to push back against that. We don't eschew quantitative data. You have to be living in data at all times, but we try and combine a robust sense of quantitative data with an equally robust sense of qualitative data, trying to understand that even the broadest geopolitical forces, economic forces, political conflicts are ultimately about human beings and what human beings do. Economics is just the sum of what every individual does in their daily life. Politics is also very personal in a way. So we're trying to supply that perspective to companies and investors for whom international political risk is becoming more important. And that's maybe a good segue to the report because, I obviously have a self-interested business rationale for these things being important, but I think COVID really did accelerate some of the geopolitical trends and have made geopolitics maybe a lot more important, and certainly have made people a lot more aware of geopolitics than they were before the pandemic.
Right. Yeah, I was going to mention, before COVID, we would ask these questions at a very high level. We would just say, what are the most pertinent geopolitical issues right now? But now we're actually inserting post COVID-19. Why is that important? So how does COVID-19 impact all of this list that we're about to get into?
Yeah, well, it's funny. So we launched Perch last March. I deliberately was just waiting for a global pandemic to launch my own business. I've always had great timing in my life. But it's funny. So when we went to market at Perch, we put together a couple reports that we wanted to put on the website that were free and public facing.
Right.
A lot of our work is for clients, so it's private. I can't share that stuff publicly. So we put together a couple reports, and one of the reports was sort of the top geopolitical trends of the 2020s, and spent most of February and March putting that report together. And then we were going to launch the next month, and obviously COVID happened as well. And I say all that because at the time it was remarkable how little that report changed due to COVID. The only thing that really changed was the timeline of some of the predictions. And that's why, since the pandemic broke out, since we all first went into lockdown in our homes last March, I've been saying over and over and over again that COVID is not a disruptive event. It feels very disruptive in our personal lives, but at the geopolitical level, it is not disruptive at all. It is an accelerant. So it has moved certain things forward that were already happening. I think it has also eliminated some of the possibilities for change. For instance, I think U.S.-China relations, I would have been more optimistic in 2019 going into 2020 about maybe some kind of more pragmatic basis for those relations. I think COVID-19 has taken away those exit ramps. I think the United States and China are now locked into I don't want to say a confrontation, but they're on a very negative trajectory, and they're running out of off ramps for getting away from a confrontation down the road. So that's why I think it's important to think about COVID not as something that fundamentally changed things around us, but rather that was accelerating these trends that were percolating beneath the surface, but which people really hadn't focused on yet.
Right. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. So you did it. You mentioned one that's on the list. What's happening with China, right? So I guess I don't know if these were in any particular order, but do you want to take that one? I mean, is that one? Are these in order?
I don't.
I can edit this part out. It's fine. I'm just curious. I didn't ask.
Oh, no, you don't have to edit it out. I'm chill. They're not in any particular order, and depending on what day of the week it is, I could probably make a case that one is more important than the other. From just a strict geopolitics standpoint, because some of the other issues really bring in a lot of other elements that are, I mean, they're connected to geopolitics, but they're not purely geopolitical, right? The U.S.-China relationship really is almost 100% pure geopolitics.
Right.
And it comes down, ironically, to, I think, the internal structural forces in both countries. China is a remarkably fascinating place. It is going to define what happens in the world for the next 10 or 20 years, for better and for worse, and for good and for bad. And there, it's really going to depend on what happens, I think, not between the US and China, that's for down the road, but what's going to happen in China itself. Is the Chinese Communist Party just at the beginning of its power? Is the centralization of Xi Jinping's power the sign that a new dynasty, if you will, is consolidating control and it's going to have another 100 years of rule? Is it a sign of weakness and defensiveness, and the Chinese Communist Party feels that it needs to batten down the hatches ahead of these huge structural changes that are about to happen in the economy? I can make the argument both ways. Similarly, is China going to feel more aggressive than it is right now in the future? One of the interesting things about Chinese history is that the Chinese have been relatively contained within their own land-based power. So that's bad news if you're on the Korean Peninsula, bad news if you're in Southeast Asia. But for the rest of the world, there are not a lot of episodes of China going out into the world and being imperialistic and aggressive. The flip side, of course, though, is that something historically unprecedented is happening in China right now, where for the first time in Chinese history, as far as I'm aware, China is dependent on importing things from abroad to maintain their economy. So they are importing oil, and they're importing gas, and they're importing water and food and cobalt, all these things that they used to have internally enough of to get by, they're importing. So you have to wonder, is this Japan 2.0? Are they going to create a military force that can project power globally so that they can secure access to the supply chains that give them all these materials that their economy is dependent on? These are open questions. We'll have to see where China goes. Similarly, with the United States, I think the United States is going through a major political transition. It's probably depressing for you and me, and I assume some of your American-based listeners, to watch what's happening to the social and political fabric of this country. And I don't know whether this is uplifting or not, but for me, I just look back at history, and this has happened before. Yeah. It happened in the late 1920s and early 1930s. It happened in the 1890s. It happened in the 1860s. We fought a civil war in that episode. Hopefully we can avoid that as well. But these periods always have the same sort of attributes. You get higher wealth inequality. You get intense divisions within the country itself, where what used to be, the old political parties don't map on perfectly to the ideologies that you thought that they had. The Republicans used to be the party of free trade. Then it was Trump and tariffs. Then it's back to, none of these things are starting to make sense. And that unintelligibility tells you that something is shifting beneath the surface. So you put those things together. Ironically, I think when we're talking about what's going to happen between the US and China in 10 or 15 years, a lot of it's going to depend on what happens in China and what happens in the United States, and then playing that forward and seeing how they're going to react kind of down the line. And yeah, I mean, it is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, and the direction that both the United States and China go, just because they are such a large part of the global population and the global economy. It's going to affect everything else that it touches. You can see that in the way that, everything from supply chains to inflation, all this stuff is based on what's going on between the US and China.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. So let me ask an industry question or a political risk question. At the top of your statement, you were asking all of these hypotheticals about China, the questions that we should be asking when we want to understand this from a geopolitical sense. How do you and your team, or how do you and the analysts that you work with sit down and narrow those down to get to a firm conclusion? Is that possible? Is that how it works? Am I thinking about it correctly? How do you work yourself through that sort of muddleness?
Yeah, it's honestly one of the reasons it's one of the reasons I started a company, because
Right.
Working at Stratfor and GPF, those were amazing experiences and amazing training experiences, but they're largely B2C publications. So they're trying to be their own version of The Economist in a way. They're trying to cover everything and for all people. And you and I can sit here and spitball and say interesting things about the US and China all day.
Right.
But for me, what's really important and what's really interesting is making those insights actionable for clients. So, I have to start and be thinking about those larger abstract issues. But if you're, let's do a hypothetical here. I mean, if you're a US multinational company, you've been moving away from the Chinese labor market just because of rising costs there in general. And let's say you've relocated some of your staff to Vietnam, Taiwan, and South Korea, maybe some Indonesia, Malaysia. And you're trying to think about how you want to plan your supply chain 5-10 years from now. You're going to have some very, very specific questions about, okay, well, how is the US-China relationship going to affect my operations in Malaysia? Full stop. Or I can give you an example of, let's say, one of our investment clients. This is halfway across the world here, but let's say an investment client wants to invest in a gold mine somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, and they're concerned that government policy towards gold mines might turn towards nationalization or increased taxes on gold mining profits, and that's going to affect whether they want to invest in the mine or invest in the gold company itself. That's a place where I have to get real highfalutin about the high-level political risks forces, but at the end of the day, we have to make a very discrete call to that investor and say, well, here are the risks. Here's what we think the likelihood of this risk coming to fruition is. Here are the possible scenarios. So it gets very, very specific. And it goes back to what I was saying about Perch. It's about, you have to marry the quantitative and the qualitative. You have to marry the broad with the very specific. All those. So you have to marry the strategic with the tactical. Forest for the trees. Whatever trite aphorism you want to put in there is what we do. And so in the context of this conversation, you and I are spitballing about the abstract stuff. But what I do in my business life is I take these abstract things and I get very, very specific questions from clients who have very specific interests, and I explain how these broad forces are going to affect them in particular, and how they can either avoid the risk that comes with those things, or it's more fun to capitalize on opportunities. I think one of the other things that has been happening in the political risk space is that it's always fear. It's always, you should be worried about this bad thing is going to happen.
Be cautious. So warning clients to be conservative in their approach to new business, right? That's what everyone's doing.
It is, and it's important, and you should be cautious.
Sure, yeah.
But if all you're doing is saying, be cautious of this and be cautious of that, by the way, this is one way the world could end, and this is another way your world could end. And if you're not also being like, and hey, here's an opportunity, like if you're not somehow getting to that positive active thing, you're not very useful to the client, in my opinion. So that's another thing that we try to do. So that was a long-winded answer to your question.
No worries.
It's prone to them.
I find this fascinating, and I think most of my listeners will too, because I mean, I think probably a lot of people are just unaware of what this type of service does, what risk analysis is. I think probably when a lot of people think about it, they're thinking of, the financial side, like what banks do. But that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on. So no, I appreciate long-winded answers. That's great. I'm curious though, if there's, just as a side question before we continue on to the list, has there ever been a situation where you've delivered like a dossier or a summary or whatever the product is, the end product to a user, and then something like drastically changed politically, like during that delivery? Or am I thinking about that in a little bit too much of a naive way?
Absolutely. This is another thing that's wrong with the industry, in my opinion. Look, like, how can I explain this pithily, or at least shortly, because I want to be less long-winded. Politics and geopolitics, economics, all these forces that we're talking about, they're all dynamic. Right. So the moment that you sit down and try and sum it up on a piece of paper, something that is static, that doesn't change, it's actually an act of incredible hubris.
It's already wrong, right? As soon as it's printed.
Well, yes, it is. As soon as you put something down on paper, it is in jeopardy of being wrong, which is why you have to work really, really hard to make sure that what you're saying actually applies going forward. But this is also why I tell my clients, there's no crystal balls, there's no magic 8 balls, there's no silver bullet magic solution. Anybody who's telling you that is selling you a bill of goods. I can give you, I don't even give my clients forecasts. I give them scenarios, and I give them likelihoods of the scenarios.
Interesting.
And then I give them signposts, what to look for if the scenario is right. And then much more importantly, what to look for if the scenario is wrong. If you don't have a falsifiable thesis or prediction, the actual analytical work is of relatively little value. So if I have done my work correctly, not only does, I may have made a call about something to my client, but if I've done my work correctly, I've also anticipated where I might be wrong and what my client should be looking for to see if I'm wrong. And then, they may have made some decisions in the other direction, but at least they would have thought about what the worst case scenario was. And they might have a backup plan or a contingency plan because they've already been thinking through the thing that could happen to them. That's honestly where this kind of analysis is most important. It's about making sure you're prepared for a full spectrum of possibilities rather than identifying the right thing. So have I had reports where I delivered something to a client and had a scenario where I was like, and if I'm wrong, here are all the things that you might see, and we might have to redo this analytical exercise if these things change? Yes, that's happened all the time. Wow. I'm proud to say I've never delivered something where I was like, this is exactly what's going to happen, and the complete opposite happened. That's not the kind of work that I'm interested in doing. So
interesting. We'll continue with the list. I think the next was the Unraveling of Globalization. This is probably a big one. But what do you have for that part?
Yeah, this is a difficult one.
Yeah. First of all, let's explain what we mean by globalization for the average listener. That might be a little bit of a loaded / academic term, and I know probably maybe not everybody is completely familiar. So, how do you see globalization from a geopolitical perspective?
Yeah, for me, it's just about the internationalization of supply chains and markets. It's actually relatively simple. So the idea that your iPhone is made of however many different components that are manufactured in however many different countries and then assembled in one place and then shipped all across the world. The global economy is completely interconnected. There are very few things that are just made in one place for one market, and that's it. It's about the interconnection of all markets together is how I describe globalization.
Okay. And that process is unraveling.
Yeah, it's unraveling. The reason it's difficult is because I think it is unraveling, but it's also going to proceed forward again. So I'm contradicting myself. Let me say a little bit more about that.
Sure.
I think it's more that the previous era of globalization, we've reached a sort of high water mark. And I think what's going to happen going forward is you're going to have these defined spheres of influence where there's going to be competition between them. Like there's probably going to be a Chinese sphere of influence, a US sphere of influence. The European Union would like its sphere of influence. Russia. We can go down the list if you want of countries that have the level of power and economic influence to create those spheres of influence. There will be more competition between those blocks. But I think within those blocks, things will start to globalize even more. So I don't have a word for what this looks like, but on the top, at the very, very top level, you're probably going to see more competition and more focus on autarky and these other things. But within these blocks and these spheres of influence, you're probably going to get even more integration. And even if you're in rival spheres of influence, you're probably going to see more integration. The US and Chinese economies, despite everything Trump has done, everything that Xi did, everything that Biden is doing, they're still intimately linked. You can't flip a switch and suddenly China and the US are going to be disconnected from each other.
Right.
And even if the governments want that, both Chinese companies and American companies don't want that at all, because they've been projecting growth based on either access to the Chinese market, access to the US market, what have you. So it's one of the reasons that, there's a lot of talk about a new Cold War between the US and China.
Right.
I feel like everybody and their mom brings up it's World War II,
Sure.
Hitler metaphors, all this other stuff. I think those are all terrible mental models for how to think about what's going on in the world. For me, it's the 1890s and the early 1900s. And I use that example because in the early 1900s, it was clear that Britain and Germany were on a collision course. Germany was the rising power. Britain was trying to stay on top. All these other things. There were diplomatic problems. There were trade disputes. All of the issues that you would expect between a rising power that wants a bigger role on the global stage. And during that time period, trade between Britain and Germany increased. They traded with each other more. Their economy, right up until the moment they were fighting each other, their economies were becoming more and more and more linked. So that's why I say it's complicated with globalization. It's not that I'm saying globalization is going to stop. I'm not saying that everybody's going to retreat behind a wall. I do, however, think that governments are insisting on as much self-reliance and independence on critical industries as possible, and want to use economics as a political tool in a way that really they didn't use it since 1991 and since the end of the Cold War. That's what we're seeing. And there's going to be a push and pull, and that process is going to be messy, and it's going to really depend on where you are and what the politics of where you are look like. But that's what I mean by the unraveling of globalization. It's a new framework, not necessarily that just globalization is going to stop full scale.
Sure, certainly. And it certainly couldn't, right? Because the infrastructure is already here, right? The Walmarts are already built and still running at full speed, or as much as they can. The ports are open. The United States is, like you said, selling oil to China, who's importing oil now for the first time in many years. The infrastructure exists. So what we're seeing is probably a fluctuation in the level of, or the level of globalization, I guess. Is that a correct way of thinking about it?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of summing it up.
Yeah, interesting. Tech revolution, the revolution in tech. So we have coming 5G, more tech innovations. Let's talk about that a little bit. That was next on the list.
Yeah, it's so we're on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution. We've gone from first, second, third industrial revolution. We went from steam to electricity to digital, and now we're going to the fourth industrial revolution. Anybody who tells you they know exactly what this is going to look like doesn't know what they're talking about. We don't know what it's going to look like yet, but I think we're on the cusp of some major technological advances. 5G, we're not even we don't even have real 5G networks yet. It's probably going to take until the end of the decade to get 5G networks. And nobody really knows what we're going to be able to do with these really, really high, low latency networks. We just haven't had the networks yet. So all these companies and innovators and entrepreneurs, they haven't even had the opportunity to start experimenting with what they're going to be able to do on these networks, but it's going to open up a range of possibilities. The biotech sector is transforming. I don't know how your listeners feel about vaccines, but the most amazing thing that has come out of COVID was the production of these mRNA vaccines in less than a year. And they could have probably been produced less than that because they were designed so early on in the pandemic. That's going to change biotech in general, from how we treat disease to how we treat viruses to all. Even if we get into, before we were dealing with COVID, we were dealing with African swine fever epidemic in China, which affected their entire pork industry, because I forget, it was like half of their their pigs died from African swine fever. All the research that's going into that, I think we're entering a new phase of sort of biotech in general. Space is another one. I mean, I know that Jeff Bezos likes to ride around on his rocket, but the more important thing there is the way that countries are going to start competing in space. Every dystopian science fiction novel you read about the next world war starts in space for a reason, because whoever can control space is going to be in a much better position than the countries that they're fighting with. So that's going to be a new domain of competition, and where there is competition, there is technological advancement. And then I'm less qualified to speak about artificial intelligence just because I haven't done the research as much as
Machine
some
learning.
of those other sectors. Yeah, but my sense is that we're still far away from that really reaching a zenith. But that's one of the reasons 5G is interesting, because 5G will allow the speeds and latency that you need for some levels of automation and for some of these data processing capacities that you need to even think about this stuff. So those are just the four right now that look most interesting to me. That's before we even talk about climate change, ways of storing energy, different ways of harvesting energy. I mean, all this stuff, it feels like we're making major progress on all of them. So there is probably within those buckets a tech revolution that we can already see coming. And there's probably something that I didn't mention that somebody's going to come up with in 5 years that will completely transform everything. That's technology is one of the true black swans of geopolitics, because things can change overnight when somebody has something legitimately new and disruptive.
Certainly. Yeah. And if we do not thrust ourselves into environmental catastrophe, we will see what happens there. But yeah, that brings us to climate change. So climate change was the fourth on your list. Why is this a geopolitical, an aspect of geopolitics that is important post COVID-19?
Well, geopolitics at its simplest is the intersection of geography and power. And if climate change is going to change geography, it's going to change a major component of geopolitics. One of the things about geopolitics is that you're supposed to find the things that don't change that much, which is supposed to be geography, and how those things either limit nations or affect relations between nations. But if climate change is going to completely upend different nations' geography, it's going to absolutely have a major impact. And that's before we even get just to the politics of climate change itself, because one of the things that has happened in really just the last 2 years is that climate change is now a political, I mean, it was always a political issue, but it's a live political issue, right? Like France is holding up a free trade deal between the European Union and Mercosur because of quote unquote concerns over climate change. That's not really why they're doing it, but that's the excuse that they're using.
Sure.
That's what I mean. You're getting all of this signaling, all of this politicization of climate change that countries are using in order to get to their strategic ends as well. So there's the climate change component, and then there's the politics of climate change component. And sometimes those are completely separate, but I think both of those things are going to change geopolitics in the decade ahead. And, we didn't rank these. Climate change is probably my number one, and everything else is sort of 1B.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, for me, I think it's the biggest issue facing geopolitics in the decade ahead, full stop.
Interesting. Yeah. So is a climate change scenario or a climate change aspect something that you provide to your clients in everything that you're providing them as a service, or is this something that you consider? How do you use climate change in your everyday business?
It really depends on what the client in particular wants.
Sure.
So at the broadest level, I mean, I have to have a finger on the pulse of what's going on in the world. So if I'm not understanding how climate change is affecting the world, I'm not ready to help my clients when they have a more specific question.
Right.
But it really just depends on the nation in question. I mean, one of the last things I did before the pandemic was I was in Canada speaking at a conference with a bunch of Western Canadian grain farmers, and was talking to them about what climate change projections mean for their crop yields and for Canada's agricultural yields in general, and what climate change is going to mean for the agricultural yields of some of their competitors. Doesn't look very good for some of Canada's competitors, whereas things actually look pretty good for Canada if you're thinking long term. So in that particular case, climate change was a huge issue. If you are, I don't know, if you're frontier investing in a market like Uzbekistan, for instance, all of the Central Asian countries, water scarcity is going to be a massive issue. It's true in Chinese-India relations as well. So thinking about everything from what water scarcity is going to mean. Is there going to be competition over water? Is that an opportunity if you're somebody who has water desalination technology or water pipeline technology, all this other stuff? Those are instances where climate change would have a real and pressing impact. It can also have indirect effects. If you're a country that is predisposed to political and social unrest already, and something happens that exacerbates the situation, whether it's a climate disaster or a drought or something like that, then you probably need to be thinking about climate change as well. I mean, we've seen global food prices here spike in the last 12 months. That's climate change. We don't talk about how it's climate change, but if you want to understand why Peru suddenly has a close to communist president and why South Africans are fighting each other in the streets, and the South African government's calling in the South African military to pacify the situation, go down the list. I mean, a lot of it has to do with rising food prices, and rising food prices is right within a climate change wheelhouse. So all this stuff is interconnected. The real challenge is tying it to particular concerns for a particular client. But at the broad level, if you're not thinking about climate change as that important, you're going to miss the ways that it's literally affecting everything around us.
Interesting. Yeah, food prices and maybe even accessibility was was one of the things I was going to ask, or probably actually mention as probably one of my honorable mentions. Did you have any honorable mentions of geopolitical issues that we should be thinking of post COVID-19?
Well, I invite folks to check out perchperspectives.com because I have a top 10 list of geopolitical forces that I think are going to affect the 2020s. The few that I would call out right now, the first is India. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about China, but I think whether India is in the beginning of a consolidation phase as a more Hindu nationalist country or not is going to be very interesting and very important going forward. I think whether the European Union comes together and really becomes a more sovereign, more powerful entity is going to be a really important question for geopolitics. Talking about food, I think whether sub-Saharan Africa can implement even some basic advances when it comes to agricultural technology and stop selling cash crops abroad and actually start creating local food networks that actually work for populations there, that's going to affect a lot of sub-Saharan African growth. So those are just a few, and we've mentioned some others, but folks can definitely check out our website if they want to hear more from me on that.
Yeah, no, awesome. One last question, and I could be way off here because it may not be something that you get into, but I'm just curious because it just came to my head. How often does a military issues or conflict play a role in you forecasting or providing these scenarios to your clients? Do they?
Depends if you're a tech company who has made a strategic bet on Taiwan for a lot of your manufacturing or for sourcing your semiconductors, yeah, you're going to care a lot about a potential military conflict. A couple of years ago, oh God, was that 4 years ago? I can't remember when President Trump was threatening to go to war with North Korea.
Yeah.
That was a huge deal because South Korea, Japan, they are incredibly integral part of tech supply chains as well. So if you're operating in that space and suddenly things look like they're going crazy on the Korean Peninsula, that's going to matter to you a great deal.
Sure.
If you are, if you're an energy company or if you're dependent on importing something from the Middle East, like what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz and what's happening in Middle Eastern power politics, all of that matters. So yes, there are times where you have to do that kind of worst case scenario analysis. And one of the things about the war, I can actually give you a concrete example. Look at what's going on in Ethiopia right now.
I was about to ask. My last episode was about this, and I've kind of gone viral with the Tigranians or the folks in Tigray, and I've got more hits off that last episode than anyone. But anyway, yeah, I was going to ask about that as an example of smaller conflicts. What happens? Is that also a part of your business when things almost overnight turn into a small conflict that erupts into a humanitarian crisis that we've seen in Tigray?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not doing my job right if that sort of thing happens overnight. I've been writing about Ethiopia now for over a year. A couple months ago, at least, I gave a talk to an apparel supply chain industry magazine conference. And I mentioned the apparel industry because a lot of the apparel industry has been looking to locate away from China where wages are going up, and they're looking for new places to put their factories. So Bangladesh has soaked up a lot of that. But Ethiopia has been a lot of apparel companies have bet on Ethiopia as a future place for low cost production. And I warned some of these companies a couple months ago, you should be watching what's going on in Ethiopia very, very closely. This does not look good. The moment that Abiy Ahmed just sort of canceled elections indefinitely. Yeah. It's one thing to postpone elections in the context of COVID-19. A lot of countries did that. Sure. He didn't postpone. He canceled indefinitely.
Right.
And then there was a lot of trouble in getting them organized. He had to postpone them a couple other times. That was a very, very negative signal, I think, for Ethiopia going forward. And I've been sounding the alarm bell on Ethiopia since then. The Tigray crisis is unbelievably tragic. It's unbelievably sad. So I don't mean to cheapen the conflict in any way. It's horrible. But another thing I've been saying is that the real question here is whether Ethiopia is going to hold together, because that is a huge country. It's in a very strategic location. It is a lot of different ethnic groups. Abiy Ahmed's whole thing is about trying to build an Ethiopian identity and not wanting things to be so siloed.
Right.
Whatever you think about him, that is the grand strategic goal.
Sure.
And the real concern for me about Tigray in terms of Ethiopia as a bigger issue is this going to spill over into ethnic violence in other parts of Ethiopia? And in the last couple of weeks, that's been happening too.
It has happened, yes.
And so if Ethiopia is going to start coming apart at the seams, that's a big deal, for a lot of different countries and for a lot of different companies that have been betting on Ethiopia going forward. It's a country with 100 million people right next to one of the biggest, choke points in the entire world. And the human cost is going to be catastrophic. I mean, the Tigray conflict is just unfortunately a peek into just how bad things could get if that conflict mushroomed out of control. So
it's a very dire situation and something we'll certainly have to continue watching. Anything else? Any other honorable mentions that you might have? What else do you think that we should be thinking about, I guess, just generally when it comes to global politics?
I think that's a pretty exhaustive and long list there.
I want to give my listeners more. They need to have homework. No, I'm just kidding. That's totally fine. No, great. That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I do appreciate your time. Thank you. Would you like to provide the contact information for Perch Perspectives, your social media, how people can follow you, and all of that?
Sure. So the ways to follow me, perchperspectives.com is our website. If you want to chat with me, you can just email us at info@perchperspectives.com. I read everything that comes through that account. We also, on our website, we have our own podcast. Jody, we'll have to have you on at some point. We can do a little cross-pollination. Cool. And we've got some reports and stuff that we put out for free there. So if you just want to take a look at what's going on, you can, but also contact information, case studies, stories about what we do. We've also been doing a Latin America themed geopolitics newsletter called LATAM Politic for the last couple months. It's published in both English and Spanish. And it's been really cool to be doing that work because we're trying to spread some of these insights into other languages and about a region, Latin America, which I think is really undercovered. So if you want to spend the price of a fancy cup of coffee to get 3 updates a week about Latin American geopolitics, you can find us at latampolitic.com. And that's about it. Perch and LATAM Politic are the best ways to find me.
Awesome. Jacob Shapiro, I'm very happy to know you. Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Pleasure's mine. Let's do it in person next time.
Awesome. Thank you. Take care.
Cheers.